There are voices in wrestling that you can never forget. They don't just call the action, they etch moments into your memory forever. And among them, one name towers above the rest: Jim Ross. For decades, JR wasn't just a commentator, he was the heartbeat of wrestling. When his voice cracked with excitement, you felt it. When he cried out in shock, you gasped too. But what fans never saw was the chaos he endured behind the curtain. Because while JR's voice carried calm authority on screen, backstage he was often trapped in storms. Storms caused by wrestlers who were as volatile as they were legendary. And that's where this story begins. A journey into the uneasy partnerships, bitter clashes, and hidden frustrations that defined Jim Ross's most difficult years in wrestling. When JR first arrived in the WWF in 1993, he was stepping onto the biggest stage of his career. Fans saw him as the polished voice from his years in WCW, a man who could bring order to even the wildest spectacle. But behind the commentary desk, his first test was unlike anything he'd expected. He was paired with Randy Macho Man Savage, a legend of the ring, larger than life, adored by fans, and unpredictable in every sense of the word. On paper, it was a dream team, an established star and a world-class play-by-play announcer. Yet from the very first moments, JR realized this partnership was no dream. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Savage was not a man who wanted to sit behind a desk. His passion was the ring, and he resented being chained to commentary. That resentment bled into every broadcast. JR, who came from a traditional school of announcing, believed in structure. The play-by-play announcer sets the pace, guides the story, and carefully feeds the color commentator at the right moments. But Savage didn't care for structure. He spoke when he wanted, about what he wanted, and often pulled the show in directions that JR had no way of steering. For an announcer trying to build credibility in a brand new company, this was suffocating. Every broadcast felt like walking on eggshells. Worse yet, Savage's paranoia seeped into their working relationship. He constantly second-guessed JR, questioning his calls, nitpicking his words, even undermining him live on air. It created an environment where JR could never fully settle into his role. Imagine calling a fast-paced match with the crowd roaring, the wrestlers moving like lightning, and all the while the legend next to you silently judging every syllable you spoke. For JR, the commentary desk, once a place of pride, became a battlefield. But to the world, it looked like nothing was wrong. That was JR's burden, carrying chaos in silence. Still, JR understood the reality. This was Randy Savage, one of the biggest stars in wrestling history. The kind of name you didn't argue with, the kind of star who could bully his way through a broadcast and still be untouchable. JR admitted years later that he didn't like Savage personally, but he respected what he represented. And maybe JR reflected, it was Savage's very unpredictability, his volatility, that made him such a star. But respect didn't make the broadcasts easier. It only deepened JR's frustration because he knew Savage wasn't giving his all to commentary. He was just counting the days until he could get back into the ring. That tension never truly ended. It simply lingered, a shadow over JR's earliest days in WWF. If Savage was difficult, then Shawn Michaels was a whole different monster. By the mid-90s, Michaels was the face of the WWF, the star Vince McMahon had chosen to carry the new generation. Fans adored him, his matches dazzled crowds, and his charisma was undeniable. But backstage, Michaels was volatile, arrogant, and nearly impossible to manage. And unfortunately for JR, as the head of talent relations, it fell directly on his shoulders to keep Michaels in line. Imagine being the man tasked with keeping peace in a locker room full of fragile egos, and your biggest star was also the most destructive. That was JR's reality. Complaints about Michaels landed on JR's desk daily. Wrestlers frustrated with his attitude, agents frustrated with his antics. Yet JR's hands were tied. Why? Because Shawn had a lifeline that no one else had, Vince McMahon himself. Michaels had Vince's ear, Vince's trust, and Vince's protection. If Shawn wanted something, more often than not, he got it. And for JR, that was maddening. He knew the locker room was watching, and when they saw Michaels act out with no consequences, it bred resentment and chaos. But what could he do? To confront Michaels was to confront Vince, and that was a battle JR could never win. It wasn't just backstage where Michaels caused headaches. his temper and arrogance spilled directly into the ring. One infamous example came at SummerSlam 1996. Michaels, in the middle of a match with Vader, lost his cool when Vader missed a spot. Instead of covering for him like a professional, Shawn shouted at him in the ring, kicked him in the head, and berated him in front of thousands of fans. To JR, it was a disgrace, a public humiliation of a veteran wrestler, and a stain on the company. But Michaels didn't care. He knew Vince would protect him. And so, the pattern continued. For JR, this was not just about unprofessionalism. It was about control. He believed wrestling worked when it was logical, when it maintained realism so fans could believe. But when your top star openly disrespects opponents in the ring, when he mocks his rivals in promos with cheap shots about their personal lives, as Shawn did with Bret Hart, the illusion shatters. Fans might cheer or boo, but for JR, it meant something deeper was breaking. The respect that bound the business together was unraveling, and he was powerless to stop it. That powerlessness haunted him. And yet, as bad as things were with Michaels, they were only the beginning, because looming on the horizon were more storms, more betrayals, and more clashes that would test JR like never before. From returning icons who refused to play by the rules, to superstars who held entire pay-per-views hostage, to creative minds who mocked his very identity, the road ahead for Jim Ross was darker than he could ever have imagined. But to understand just how deep the chaos went, we have to continue down that road, and it only gets more explosive from here. If Jim Ross thought Shawn Michaels was the peak of his problems, he soon learned that the business had even more brutal tests in store for him. The year was 1996, and WWF was desperately fighting for survival against WCW's surging popularity. The company needed stability, but instead JR was caught in a hurricane of egos, betrayals, and impossible decisions. He had one mission: hold the roster together and protect the product. But the truth was, every week felt like another bomb waiting to explode, and JR was the man expected to defuse it. The problem was, the bombs kept getting bigger. The Montreal Screwjob in 1997 became one of the darkest chapters in wrestling history, and for JR, it was a moment that shattered any illusion of control he thought he had. Despite being the head of talent relations, JR wasn't informed of the plan to double-cross Bret Hart. Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels kept him completely in the dark. For a man who had dedicated himself to maintaining fairness and professionalism, this betrayal cut deep. When the infamous bell rang and Bret realized he'd been robbed of the title on live television, the fallout wasn't just between Bret and Vince, it fell on JR too. He was left cleaning up a mess he never even knew was coming. To him, it was proof that even his authority meant nothing in the political games of WWF. But as JR tried to recover from the chaos of Montreal, another storm had already taken shape. The company brought back the Ultimate Warrior, hoping his star power would help revive ratings. Instead, what they got was a disaster wrapped in face paint. Warrior had always been known for being difficult, but this time his selfishness reached new heights. He demanded special treatment, skipped shows, and alienated almost everyone around him. For the locker room, it was infuriating. For JR, it was a nightmare. He had to stand in front of frustrated wrestlers, explaining why Warrior seemed to get away with everything, when deep down he agreed with them. Warrior was nothing but trouble. The breaking point came during a feud with Jerry Lawler, one of JR's closest friends. The angle called for Lawler to smash a framed picture over Warrior's head. The glass was fake. Everyone knew it. But Warrior, in a display of sheer arrogance, walked out wearing a baseball cap under his long hair to protect himself. To JR, it was humiliating. It ruined the illusion, disrespected Lawler, and screamed to the world that Warrior cared only about himself. In JR's eyes, it was the moment Warrior proved he brought nothing of value to the company. Behind the scenes, JR considered him the most unprofessional and toxic person he had ever worked with. And still, JR had to smile on air. He had to call the shows with energy and excitement while knowing the reality was falling apart. But as bad as Warrior was, the problems didn't end there. In 1999, Jeff Jarrett threw gasoline on the fire. As Intercontinental Champion, Jarrett's contract was set to expire the day before a major pay-per-view where he was booked to drop the title to China. Instead of negotiating quietly, Jarrett backed JR and the entire company into a corner. He demanded $300,000 up front, refusing to lose the belt unless he got paid. To JR, it was blackmail, pure and simple. The show, the storylines, the fans, it was all being held hostage by one man's greed. What made Jarrett's betrayal sting even more was the history. Just a year earlier, JR had been forced to cut Jarrett's guaranteed pay by $100,000. Jarrett never forgave him, and this was his revenge. He confronted JR face to face, ranting about being screwed, while JR stood there, knowing the company had no choice but to cave. That night, Jarrett lost the belt and walked straight out the door to WCW, but JR never forgot it. For a man who believed in loyalty and trust, it felt like one more knife in the back. The constant betrayals wore on him. JR wasn't just an announcer, he was the voice of reason in a world spinning out of control. And yet, even his voice was targeted. Enter Vince Russo, the head writer by 1999. Russo believed in shock value, chaos, and soap opera over wrestling. JR believed in logic, structure, and realism. Their philosophies clashed like fire and gasoline, and Russo didn't just disagree with JR, he hated him. He mocked JR's southern accent, dismissed him as old-fashioned, and even saw him as a threat to his influence. But Russo's cruelty didn't stop there. After Russo jumped to WCW, he and his writing partner, Ed Ferrara, created a parody character named Oklahoma, designed to mock Jim Ross directly. The character imitated JR's announcing style, but worst of all, it mocked his Bell's palsy, a condition that partially paralyzed his face. For JR, who had given his life to wrestling, it was beyond insulting. It was dehumanizing. To make fun of a man's disability, something he struggled with privately, on national television, was an act of cruelty that cut to his very core. It wasn't just Russo crossing the line. It was proof of how vicious the business could be when egos ran unchecked. By this point, JR had endured it all. Paranoia from legends, arrogance from top stars, betrayals from champions, and cruelty from creative minds. He had seen the absolute best of wrestling in the ring, but behind the curtain, he had been forced to confront its ugliest truths. The question wasn't just how much more he could take, it was why he still stayed. And that question leads us into the final chapter of his story, where loyalty, passion, and resilience collide with pain, humiliation, and redemption. Because as much as JR endured, there was still one final layer to uncover. Why did he never walk away? The hardest thing about being Jim Ross wasn't the shouting matches, the betrayals, or even the constant ridicule. It was carrying it all and still showing up with dignity. Night after night, JR sat ringside, his voice steady, his passion unwavering, while backstage his world felt like it was breaking apart. He had to be two men at once, the calm storyteller guiding millions of fans through unforgettable matches, and the weary peacemaker caught between wrestlers, management, and chaos. And yet, despite everything, JR never allowed the bitterness to consume him. That resilience is what kept his legacy intact when others around him self-destructed. But even the strongest voices have breaking points. When Russo and Ferrara mocked him on WCW television with the Oklahoma parody, it struck a wound far deeper than any professional slight. It wasn't just about insulting his work, it was mocking the very condition that had nearly cost him his career. JR had fought hard to overcome Bell's palsy, often working through pain and insecurity, forcing himself to stay confident in front of cameras when half his face wouldn't cooperate. To see that turned into a cruel joke on national TV was something he could never forgive. For the audience, it was tasteless. For JR, it was humiliating. But instead of striking back, he endured. That was his way, to let his body of work speak louder than anyone else's mockery. Still, moments like that revealed the darker truth about the business JR had given his life to. Wrestling wasn't just about athleticism and storytelling, it was about politics, egos, and power plays. The Ultimate Warrior could skip shows and still get opportunities. Shawn Michaels could humiliate opponents on live television without punishment. Jeff Jarrett could hold a company hostage for money and walk away smiling. And writers like Russo could manipulate narratives and even humiliate veterans if it meant a headline. JR believed in respect, in logic, in honoring the fans' intelligence. Too often, those values were trampled in favor of chaos. That constant tug of war between his beliefs and the business's reality was the weight he carried every day. And yet, through all of this, fans loved JR not because of what he endured behind the scenes, but because of what he gave them in front of the camera. He was the voice that turned matches into epics. When he screamed, Stone Cold, during Steve Austin's rise, fans felt history in the making. When he cried out in horror at Mick Foley being thrown from the top of Hell in a Cell, the shock was etched into wrestling lore forever. His authenticity made every moment feel real, even when backstage politics threatened to make everything feel fake. In many ways, JR was the bridge between fans and the unpredictable world of wrestling. He made us believe, even when he struggled to believe himself. Behind that voice was also a man of incredible loyalty. JR didn't stick with the company through all that turmoil because he loved the politics. He stayed because he loved wrestling. He loved discovering new talent, nurturing careers, and giving opportunities to future stars. He believed in the business, even when the business didn't always believe in him. And that loyalty was both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. It kept him tied to a world that often treated him cruelly, but it also gave wrestling its greatest commentator, a man who carried the stories of others even when his own story was painful. When we look back now, it's tempting to wonder why JR didn't just walk away. After all, he had every reason to. He was insulted, undermined, betrayed, and mocked. But if you ask JR himself, the answer was simple. Wrestling wasn't just a job, it was his life. The fans deserved better. The wrestlers who respected the craft deserved a voice that honored their work. And JR was willing to endure the worst of the business to ensure the best parts still shined through. His resilience wasn't about stubbornness, it was about love for the fans, for the talent, and for the business itself. Of course, JR wasn't perfect. He had his flaws, made his mistakes, and sometimes allowed his frustration to show. But when compared to the chaos around him, he was often the most grounded man in the room. He was proof that professionalism could survive even in the most unprofessional environments. That's why wrestlers respected him, even when they clashed. That's why fans trusted him, even when storylines didn't make sense. And that's why, despite all the pain, his voice remains immortal in the history of wrestling. In the end, the myths and chaos surrounding Jim Ross's career weren't about whether he hated certain wrestlers or clashed with certain stars. They were about something bigger. The fragile balance between passion and politics, between respect and chaos. JR represented the fans, the ones who wanted wrestling to feel real, who wanted to believe in the stories being told. And every time that belief was threatened by egos or betrayals, JR bore the burden of protecting it. That is what made his journey both inspiring and heartbreaking. So when we talk about Jim Ross and the wrestlers he hated working with, it isn't just about Savage, Michaels, Warrior, Jarrett, or Russo. It's about a man trying to hold the business together while it constantly tried to pull itself apart. It's about the sacrifices he made so that fans could experience wrestling at its most magical. And it's about the resilience of a voice that carried the soul of wrestling for decades. But here's the real question. If you were in JR's shoes, constantly tested, humiliated, and undermined, would you have stayed? Or would you have walked away from the business you loved, knowing it might break you?